Hey, class. Um, since we all kind of ended in different spots, I thought that I would run through the last couple parts of the Cold War with all of you. If you have already gone over this part, please feel free to skip ahead in the video, as I'll be largely repeating what we had talked about in class. But I just want to make sure that we all get the proper coverage on this topic. Uh, the Middle East tensions were fairly dramatic. In 1973, there was an effort by Egypt and Syria to invade and destroy Israel. Israel was a big ally, the primary ally in the Middle East for the United States, whereas Egypt and Syria were proxies for the Soviet Union. Proxies are representative stand-ins, if you will, for another country. The Soviet Union and America did not face off in conventional warfare. They used their proxies instead. Well, Israel, despite being attacked by both these countries, defeated both Egypt and Syria, and the U.S. and the Soviet Union brokered a truce between the parties. And everybody thought that that was pretty much going to be it. But if you'll recall, we talked about OPEC, the Organization for Petroleum Exporting Countries, in class today. OPEC, which is dominated by Muslim governments, was not happy with the United States and its support of Israel. And they punished the United States with an oil embargo. They increased oil prices 70%. Excuse me. And later increased prices by over 400%. Now, to put this in terms that we can appreciate today, this would be roughly equivalent to $7 to $8 a gallon gasoline in real terms today. This was an extraordinary event. I was alive. I was 3 years old during this crisis, and I vaguely remember being in a car in line, engine off, waiting for the gas tanker to show up, refuel, and you're limited to like 8 gallons of gasoline for your car. It was wild. Well, that drove the United States to begin investing in alternative fuel sources, wind, solar power. America consumed millions of barrels of oil a day from these OPEC oil-producing companies, or countries rather, and this really hurt America. It almost drove us into a pretty bad recession in the 70s. The government also responded with changes to automobiles. Gone were the days of the massive 60s battleships, all steel constructed cars. Rather, they were replaced with plastic, a lot more plastic and aluminum. CAFE standards on miles per gallon that a car could travel, 55-mile-an-hour speed limit on the highways, lots of changes. Now, the 70s also brought us the Carter years with Mideast changes, the peace treaty, more or less, between Egypt and Israel. Egypt became the first Muslim state to recognize Israel's right to exist. That was a pretty big deal. Many people suggest that Anwar Sadat, the president of Egypt, was assassinated precisely for that reason by one of his bodyguards a short while after this peace treaty, about a year, I think. Also, the Carter years were notorious for the overthrow of the Shah of Iran and the imposition of a new government, an Islamic republic in Iran, and the subsequent hostage taking of 53 American hostages in that country for over a year. There was a botched rescue attempt by Delta Force, which resulted in a bunch of guys dying. in the desert. And all in all, it was a pretty tough 4 years. Now, the 1980s really marked the beginning of the end of the Cold War. Reagan, unlike Carter, escalated the Cold War. He was kind of a throwback to the Truman, Eisenhower line of presidents who were confronting the Soviet state, as opposed to the detente Nixon, Carter presidents who were kind of playing ball with the Soviets, who were kind of backing off on the ideological confrontation. He ordered a massive buildup of the U.S. military and challenged the Soviet Union on ideological terms. He used terms like the Soviet Union is an evil empire, and that the Soviet Empire would end up on the ash heap of history, and these kind of terms that were pretty inflammatory. They caused the Soviets and a lot of our European allies a lot of concern. And basically, the United States challenged the Soviet Union to keep up. We're going to simultaneously increase our military and improve our military, engage in an arms race that the Soviets couldn't keep up with, and provide for domestic spending, provide for the support of our most needy people, and build infrastructure, and do all these things. And Reagan essentially looked at the Soviet Union and said, you're not going to be able to keep up. And, long story short, they couldn't. So the end of the Cold War really started coming around as the Soviet Union and the U.S. enter into an arms race, nuclear arms race, who could develop more effective, longer-ranged missiles, who could deploy them closer to the other's borders. There were massive protests going on in West Germany and the rest of Europe, and people were looking on with alarm as President Reagan engaged in what they considered brinksmanship with the fate of the world at stake. The Soviet Union was kind of nervous about this as well. A conventional buildup. Under Reagan, he built up the Navy to a 600-ship fleet, which hadn't been done since World War II. He was building up the Army and the Marine Corps. The Air Force was getting new equipment. Probably most controversially, he suggested that the United States was going to begin basic research into the Strategic Defense Initiative, derisively referred to as Star Wars, a missile defense system. Now, you'll recall from our discussion about mutual assured destruction how dangerous, quote unquote, a shield would be in this situation. Basically, if somebody had a missile shield that they thought would interfere with the second strike, the retaliatory strike from whatever country that had been struck first, that if the missile shield might be able to defend against that retaliatory strike, might encourage somebody to actually conduct a first strike. Well, the Soviet Union had a problem. They were committing something like 45% of their gross domestic product towards military spending. They couldn't keep it up. They were spending way too much relative to the size of their economy. The American economy, which had been in the doldrums in the 70s, started to pick up in the 80s, and then really went gangbusters in the mid-80s, about 1984, 85, where they had tremendous growth in GDP, gross domestic product, and the tax revenues. Even though Reagan cut taxes, revenues increased because they were collecting fewer taxes from more people, if that makes sense. The Soviet Union had an inefficient planned economy. They had a centrally planned economy that, quite frankly, couldn't keep up either. An agriculture system that we were sending them food during the 80s to feed the Russian people. They couldn't produce enough food for themselves, even though Ukraine was a breadbasket for the entire country. It was such an inefficient agriculture system. The U.S. also persuaded the Arabs to increase oil production, OPEC primarily, to increase oil productions which hurt the Soviets' oil export business because, of course, if you increase supply of something, that drives down price. So all of these things work together to hurt the Russians' ability to compete with America. The end of the Cold War really kicked in into high gear in the later 80s. Mikhail Gorbachev became the premier, and after 1985, it's interesting, Reagan switched tactics after his re-election in 84. He held 4 summits with Gorbachev. Gorbachev was a reformer who could work with Reagan. Reagan felt he could work with Gorby. They pursued pretty substantial arms agreements, and it was kind of like a carrot and stick thing. First, show the Russians the stick, challenge them into this race that they couldn't afford, and then offer them the carrot. And in return for this stuff, the Americans were asking the Soviets, hey, allow more democracy, allow free speech, allow your people to enjoy some of the things we take for granted. In June 12th, 1987, I hope you guys listened to this clip where it's highlighted Berlin's speech. It's a famous speech where Reagan, towards the end of his second term, essentially calls out Gorbachev to tear down the Berlin Wall, to obviously tumultuous applause from the Germans present. And that's what the East German people begin to do in 1989. They begin to dismantle the Berlin Wall on their own, causing a flood of people from east to west. And by 1991, not only the Berlin Wall, but the entire Soviet state collapsed. And what started as a trickle out of East Germany became a flood as the entire system came falling down. Soviet Union ceased to exist, and America and the NATO countries had won the Cold War. So we'll stop there. If you have any questions, bring them to class tomorrow. Otherwise, I'll see you then.